Thank you very much, Jeff.
Sure.
So first of all, let's talk about the upcoming U.S.-Russia summit. Why now? Why not last year? Why not after midterm election?
The meeting in Helsinki is going to follow right after the NATO summit, so Trump will be in Europe anyway. Of course, it doesn't look great having the meeting with Putin right after the NATO meeting, but I think that's part of it. I think part of it is just this is the point at which the dynamics of the meeting or of the relationship have come about to the point where both sides are interested in a summit, where they have things that they want to talk about. I think a lot of it just simply stems from Trump's own kind of unique personality and his desire to meet Putin.
What do you mean by the unique personality?
Well, in this case, I think that he thinks he knows better than his advisors or the foreign policy establishment in the United States, which has generally been hostile to the idea of a summit with Putin.
Right. And what do President Trump and President Putin expect to get from this summit, and what can they actually get?
Right. Well, so John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, said that the summit itself is the deliverable, which is a very unusual thing for a National Security Advisor to say. But I think in this case it's somewhat accurate in that for Trump, the meeting itself, the optics of it, the media coverage, the pomp and circumstance of the meeting really holds a lot of importance. I think on some level Trump probably believes that he can strike a great deal akin to the deal that I'm sure he thinks is great that he got when he met with Kim Jong-un. But at the same time, I think just the very fact of having the meeting, of pushing back against this narrative that Russia's an implacable foe, that the U.S. difficulties with Russia are seemingly insoluble, is something that Trump, on a kind of personal, maybe psychological level, relishes. On the Russian side, I think there are different interests at stake here. One, again, is the very fact of the meeting, because if the West, and this isn't only the United States, but the West more broadly, has been aiming to isolate Russia, at least since the invasion of Ukraine, having a meeting with the U.S. president on neutral soil on a kind of equal basis is, for Putin, a way of showing that he's back in the game, that the West has to deal with him and has to meet with him and has to talk with him. Given Trump's affinity, seemingly, for Russia, I think Putin probably also expects that he may be able to get something more substantive out of this meeting, whether that's some American acceptance of Russian aims in Syria, whether it's a revision of the U.S. position on sanctions, whether it's some concessions on energy or whatever it may be. But from the Russian perspective, this is probably the most propitious moment in the bilateral relationship in the last few years, given the uniqueness, I suppose, of Trump and sort of his desire for a deal. And so there's a significant hope in Moscow to get some more lasting, substantive benefit from this meeting as well.
We see the Russian scandal. So do you think that President Trump is concerned about that people might perceive this is as a further collusion with Russia?
Apparently not, because if he did, I don't think he would have taken the meeting. I think he would have listened to his advisors who were saying taking this meeting is only going to feed into this narrative that there's some kind of foul play going on in the relationship between Trump as an individual and Trump's business entities and Russia. So the fact that Trump is taking the meeting anyway, to me, seems to suggest that he doesn't really care about that narrative. He, of course, refers to it as fake news. He may well believe that himself, or at the very least believes that that's a line that he can sell to a substantial portion of the American electorate, and doesn't seem to be particularly worried about what the domestic political fallout would be.
And what's your take on the Russian scandal?
The fact that this investigation is going on and that some of the allegations about Russian involvement in the electoral process seem credible is certainly worrying. And already, we've had acknowledgement from Facebook and other social media entities about Russian efforts to manipulate public opinion through ad buys, through bots, through hacking into the servers of the Democratic National Committee, for example. So clearly there was some Russian involvement. I think the question is, and remains unanswered at this point, is what role Trump and people around Trump played in that Russian involvement and to what extent they benefited from it.
Right. And you also mentioned about the neutral status of Helsinki. We know it was important during the Cold War, but this time they are holding the summit in Helsinki makes it looks like the Cold War hasn't ended.
Well, kind of, yeah. I think it's, on the one hand, indicative of the state into which U.S.-Russian relations have fallen, that people are talking about being in a new Cold War. At the same time, at least from the Russian perspective, I think that's positive. Because for a lot of Russians, for the Kremlin, the Cold War is the model for the bilateral relationship that they want to recreate. This is when the American leaders and the Soviet leaders sat down at a table and sort of hashed out the fate of the world. And the Russian complaint for the last 25, 30 years has been that the United States and the West have systematically ignored Russia. So if you're going back to a format where you have an American president and a Russian president sitting down by themselves in a neutral capital discussing the fate of the world, again, this kind of feeds into Russian amour propre, maybe, and suggests to Putin, to the Kremlin, and to Russians more generally, that Russia is back, that it's a player that has to be taken seriously, and that it is being taken seriously.
So why not other country or capital?
Well, again, Helsinki, Finland continues to be in that liminal position that it was in during much of the Cold War, where it's closely aligned with the West, but it's not a NATO member, and it has long-standing political, cultural, historical, economic ties to Russia. So it's not being seen as it doesn't look like a concession to one side or the other to hold the meeting specifically in Helsinki. There aren't very many other places, at least in Europe, where you could do that. Maybe Vienna.
Right. Last question. Let's talk about the division of the West. We see President Trump is pushing away the European allies and at the same time is getting closer with Russia. What does this mean to the West, and what's the future for the West?
Well, there's not a single West. I think the election of Trump and similar kind of populist political phenomena in other Western countries suggests that there's a pretty profound division within the West right now about what actually being part of the West means. And the fact that you have a significant part of the American public, I would say a minority, but still a significant part, similarly to a significant part of the publics in a number of European countries, that want to have good relations with Russia, that don't see Russia's illiberal development or intervention in Western politics as being a negative, or at least as being a danger to their interests, suggests that the West is very divided right now, probably more than it's been certainly since the end of the Cold War. I think what that means is that even though the West continues to have a much stronger economic position than Russia, even though Western institutions are much more effective and more consolidated, and in most ways the West should be able to engage Russia from a position of strength, this internal divide that you see not only in the United States but in a number of other Western countries is a significant vulnerability that, as we saw in 2016, Russia has been very effective at playing upon. At the same time, in Trump, you have somebody in the United States who openly questions the value of the West as an institutional and normative community. The approach that Trump took at the G7 summit in Singapore was, I think, profoundly worrying to a lot of the established leadership in Western countries, where he seemed to suggest that they were part of the problem, and that the United States was going to be distancing itself from its close relations with its liberal democratic partners. So it's a time of uncertainty and transition for the West, and one where I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to how it's going to play out in the future.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.